This episode is brought to you by Merrill. We all have goals, and we all want to get to those goals, whether that's saving for a home renovation, that once-in-a-lifetime trip to your favourite Grand Prix, or even retirement. We all want a straightforward path to those goals, but the real world doesn't usually work that way. Merrill understands that. That's why with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalised plan and a clear path forward. And having the bull at your back helps your whole financial life move with you. So when your plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight.
Woo!
Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work. But anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Max Verstappen won the Brazilian Grand Prix from 17th on the grid, in the process as good as clinching the World Championship despite Lando Norris still being mathematically in contention. So how did he take his first proper F1 victory since June's Spanish Grand Prix, and what were two Alpine drivers doing on the podium? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to untangle a typically chaotic Interlagos Sunday afternoon are Mark Hughes and Scott Mitchell-Malm. Well, Scott, I'll come to you first. I'll say hello to you as I haven't spent the whole day with you since, 5 a.m. or whenever it was when we got up, which I'm not complaining about because I'm always complaining about things need to run earlier on Grand Prix Sundays. But it's been a typically long and chaotic Sao Paulo day for F1, hasn't it?
I would say an unusually long one because we did start very early. It's been a strange day, but an enjoyable one at the same time because it's been kind of chaotic, but I quite like the chaos. There was so much of it in the race that we've ended up finishing probably about the same time as if it had run to a normal schedule. But then again, a normal Sao Paulo race starts on time and then still takes about 3 hours to finish. So always some gains, but yeah, good fun. This is a great race. It's a great place to come to. Incredible fan support, even with the horrible weather and the awful start time this morning. The fact that so many got there super early, had to wait until the gates opened, I think at 6:30. Many of them didn't even get in time for qualifying and the new quali time, which I thought was super, super sad given the amount of effort that had gone into it. But F1 always gets a great reception here, and in response, it also usually produces a great race, and I think that's what we had today.
Yeah, very much so. And Mark, obviously, you've been through plenty of Brazilian Grand Prix chaos classics. That was right up there, wasn't it, in terms of the amount of incident and storylines?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You know you're going to get something a bit random. It's unusual if you don't in Brazil, but you never know quite how it's going to play out. And this is one of the best ones I'd come up with in those 20 odd years that I've been covering it.
Yeah, and Interlagos is always one you look forward to because you know it even if it's not a chaos race, it's often a really good race. It's such a good track for racing. Yeah, it's got everything, this one, and loads for us to sift through in this one. So we better dive straight into it. I may get interrupted by noisy people in my hotel corridor. Hopefully nobody will try and deliver a pizza to Scott at, 2 a.m. the other night? A random pizza was trying to be delivered.
1 a.m. 1 a.m. Yeah, I think I'd been asleep for about 3 hours, and a very enthusiastic hotel worker spent about 10 minutes knocking on my door trying to deliver a pizza. So none of that, Mr. Hotel Worker. I've got a podcast to record and some sleep to catch up on. Thank you.
You're definitely far more relaxed about it now than at the time, from what I hear. But anyway, Mark, we'll throw the traditional starting question to you. Sometimes this is a very straightforward question. Other times it's more complicated. So how did Max Verstappen win this one?
Helped by the conditions, of course, and which helped him overcome the big penalty of starting from P17. Used a bit of genius and used a bit of the Red Bull's significantly improved behaviour since it's upgraded Austin. They've been fine-tuning it since then, and it is becoming a steadily better car. And he was then helped by what happened with the safety car and the red flag, which took him from 4 places and 14 seconds behind Norris to 2 places in front of him. And had that not happened, I think even his genius wouldn't have been able to conjure a victory from there. But that blew the race wide open, and he capitalised as impressively as we saw. Just a fantastic performance all round.
And of course, as you say, there was a dash of luck with the red flag. But of course, Scott, there was a dash of bad luck, more than a dash of bad luck, on Sunday morning in the qualifying session when he ended up not making it to Q3, and then with the 5-place grid penalty for the engine change, that left him so far down the grid. So that's one in the eye for the great grand conspiracy that left him so far down the grid, isn't it?
Yeah, well, generally speaking, these things do have a tendency to balance themselves out. It's rare that you see them balance each other out in a single day, because we don't normally have qualifying and the race in the same day. But even in the same weekend is often strange, because you just take the highs and lows as they come through the season, don't you? And Verstappen knows that better than anyone with the world titles that he has under his belt. But this one got under his skin a lot more, which I think showed 2 things. One, the pressure that he and Red Bull have been under increasingly over the last few races, but for several months now. And the paranoia creeping into the title fight, as it always does. This isn't a Red Bull Verstappen thing. This is something that has long existed in Formula One, and you've even seen snippets of it from the McLaren side as well, with some of the stuff Zach Brown said. And so there was a lot of tension, I think, within Red Bull. And the second part is that it showed that Red Bull felt they had a quick car, especially in the wet. Verstappen seemed quite confident. He'd had good race pace in the sprint in the dry, but he seemed really up for it in the wet. So there was a missed opportunity there, and obviously knew that with the grid penalty, it was going to compound that qualifying problem. And it was just bad luck in qualifying. There were definitely ways in which race control could have handled things slightly better, a little bit sharper here, a bit of better judgment there around Lance Stroll's crash and the red flag, eventual red flag. But nothing, you don't really, in terms of what was realistic, you can't change any of that, handle that any differently, and get an outcome that doesn't end in Verstappen getting knocked out, because he was basically doomed as soon as Stroll crashed when and where he did. So, yeah, Max just seemed to, you could see it in the interviews after qualifying, he was very, very angry about it, very frustrated. But once he'd won the race, both he and Christian Horner were quite happy to accept it was just bad luck, that there wasn't anything anyone did particularly wrong or anything like that. What I will say is that Max channeled that frustration brilliantly from qualifying. There's a purpose to the way that he carries himself and the body language that his car exhibits when he's in a certain mood. And that controlled aggression in the race today, you could see it from the very start. He was decisive, he was instinctive, but he wasn't rash. It was so well judged. That first lap in particular was excellent. I can't remember if it was 4 or 5 cars that he picked off in the end, because obviously was due to start 17th, but due to the chaos, Lance Stroll didn't make it around the formation lap. Alex Albon didn't make it onto the grid, etc. But he was so good. First stint was really forceful, but well judged. Yeah, got his slice of luck with the safety car, but I'd say he earned his luck with how good he was before it, and then he was excellent afterwards. So he recovered from that morning setback and then some. This was one of the best wins I've seen in the last 6 or 7 years covering F1, and right up there for one of Max's best victories.
Yeah, absolutely. He was mighty. That first lap, some really, really good decisive moves on the brakes. Okay, the Red Bull was working well, but this was just Verstappen at his absolutely insistent best. It was absolutely wonderful to see it. No wonder he enjoyed it. But obviously, Mark, it was an interesting one because you have the hypothetical of what was the race that was going on if there was not that red flag. Of course, you had Colapinto had the big shunt actually under the safety car shortly after making a pit stop for another fresh set of inters, and it was Russell versus Norris in the early stages. So was that the battle for the win that was taken away by the way it played out? How do you see that?
Yeah, it's interesting because Lando was pushing to come in even before the VSC came out for the Hulkenberg incident. And once we got to the point where the track was so wet that the cars were beginning to aquaplane, George was almost pushing to stay out because his reasoning being that this is going to be too dangerous. It's going to be a red. So the last thing you want to be doing if you think it's going to be red is pitting and losing track position. So depending on what decisions had been made, if there hadn't been a red flag, if it had just been the safety car taking the pack through the worst of the conditions, depending on whether George had pitted or not, it would be quite interesting. You've either got George still in the lead on old tyres, with Lando in 5th place on new tyres, and the two Alpines and Verstappen in between George and Norris. So Norris would have been coming at them, and would he have had enough laps to get through them? And would they have been able to hang on to those tyres for the rest of the race? Probably not. They would probably all have had to pitted. So, I think... I think Norris lost a real chance of victory. Had Russell come in as he did, and you had just a safety car period without the red flag, then yes, it would probably been Russell versus Norris to the end, and with Max presumably having to pit at some point and getting onto new tyres, and he would have then been the fastest car on the track, and it would have been how much distance he could have caught up in the remaining laps to Norris and Russell, because there's no question that Verstappen Red Bull was the fastest combination in the wet by quite a significant margin. But you do lose a lot of time making a pit stop under full race conditions, and the others have got their stops for free.
Yeah, George Russell was really disappointed after the race, actually, because I sort of said, well, that's going to be painful. Certainly would have been a podium there if it played out differently, and asked him about advocating for staying out, and he basically said, yeah, he pushed to stay out. He and his engineer had decided to stay out, and then eventually he said, well, Shove came on the radio, Andrew Shovlin, the head of trackside engineering, and overruled them. And he said, it's one of those things that's not so clear from the pit wall, but when you're in the car, you can see there's likely a red flag coming. So, Russell was feeling very, very disappointed about that, and he obviously ended up 4th place with the 2 Alpines ahead. We'll get onto Alpine in depth later, because that's a great story, but they did the same as Verstappen by staying out and got the tyre change under the red flag. We've got a few the Race Members Club questions here that we'll bounce through, because they relate to the battle at the front, so they hopefully fill in a few gaps. The first question, Scott, Fausto Cunha and Gavin Cameron, this is a combination of the two, asking, was it really just luck? I really think Max would have won even without the red flag. It's just Lando's frustration when he says it's not talent, just luck. And this is, of course, referring to what Lando Norris said after the race.
Yeah, I've seen the clip of Lando saying that. I'm surprised that he said it. I think he'll regret saying it. It's quite disappointing. Just as a general rule, top drivers know that even if there's obviously an element of fortune in things like safety cars and red flags and whatever, they also know that to win a race like that requires skill. And he's referring specifically to Verstappen going from the position he was in the first stint to being second and in the place to lead the race. That I think that's what he's specifically referring to. But even if that is being a little bit generous and that is his intention, it's phrased really poorly, and he should just be a bit better than that, because he knows that he should know that Verstappen drove a fantastic Grand Prix, and I don't think Max would have won without the safety car in the same way that I don't think Lando would have won in Miami without the safety car, and Lando had a slightly more straightforward path to victory there than Max did today. But a lot of the beauty and brilliance of what Verstappen did lie in the way he controlled himself in the first stint, made the progress that he did, looked after the tyres, was able to go further, was able to make the intermediates last long enough to take that punt on there being a safety car or red flag, whereas others felt their tyres were crying enough, whether that was the drivers or the team saying that. And also he was just blisteringly fast in the second half of the race, and especially once he'd taken the lead. I think 10 of his last 11 laps were good enough for fastest lap. He was in a class of his own. So whether he would have won without the safety car or not, it was a deserving victory. And I think, we're all happy to sit here and say it was fantastic and fully deserved. And I think Max deserves his competitors to recognise that as well. So I think Lando will probably regret that choice of words. I hope he does, and I would imagine he's congratulated Max sincerely as well.
Yeah, drivers disappointed in the immediate aftermath of the race. It does happen sometimes. You can understand that. Mark, there's a question from Piers Langford who says, it felt strange to me that Max Verstappen and Esteban Ocon, and Pierre Gasly for that matter, didn't pit under the safety car without Franco Colapinto crashing. It seems like there wouldn't have been a red flag with Max on very worn inters. Do you think Norris wins the race without the red flag? We've kind of touched on the second part of that, but did it seem strange that they stayed out? It seemed like a sensible gambit.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where if you do what the leaders do, you're still going to be as far behind them. Whereas if you do something different in a quite realistic expectation, it's a gamble worth taking. It was more than feasible that this race was going to be red flagged, and therefore it's worth taking a punt that you could benefit from this by staying out and getting your stops for free. So I think they were also pushed in that direction by the fact that their tyres, Max's tyres in particular, were still in good shape. So they felt they had a little bit of cushion there, which they could, maybe have used post any safety car period.
The next one comes from Jake Nelson. Given how difficult overtaking was in the rain, could Esteban Ocon have won the race had he held onto the lead in the last restart? While Verstappen was easily quicker when he got in clear air, there wasn't loads of overtaking unless drivers made mistakes. I think even if Verstappen hadn't got him at the restart, he would have done. It might have been interesting if there hadn't been that safety car, because Ocon had pulled a few seconds and he was clear, not miles clear, but it would have been interesting had the race played out from there, because Max would have had to close up and battle past him. And, probably he would have done. I think Ocon himself said he wouldn't have been able to keep him behind. But he's a tricky customer to pass sometimes, Ocon. Remember that race at Suzuka a few years ago when he kept Hamilton behind him in the wet throughout? So I think Verstappen probably would have still come through even if there wasn't that safety car and he had that few second lead and Verstappen had to catch up. But I'd like to have seen him give it a go. Wouldn't that have been fun. There's a question from Jake Nelson. Scott, what are your thoughts on Norris pitting as the virtual safety car ended? Sky called it a mistake, but I don't think it was and felt this was harsh. I thought it was time to switch to new inters regardless, and a lot of the criticism seemed to be with hindsight.
Yeah, it was that classic thing of the tyres were starting to suffer. Norris was, I think, starting to complain about the intermediates, and the risk was that if more rain came, especially if there was a safety car and then the field got bunched up, if more rain came, that would not be the quality of tyre that you wanted to be on, because obviously it was getting heavier, and you saw how wet it then got. So if you didn't have your inters in a good enough condition, which very few people seemed to have, obviously the Alpines did very well to look after it, but Verstappen was obviously tucked up in a train of, was it 3 cars in front of him?
Yeah.
And managed to look after the tyres. So that just showed how well he was driving and how well in the sweet spot Red Bull had got their car. So I think McLaren, I think they just had to respond to the realities of the conditions and the situations. It is always easier when you're the chasing car and you've got less to lose to run that risk with the safety car and red flag. When you're one of the top 2, I think you go with what the conditions and the track demands, and listen to the driver, right? Like Norris was saying that he needed it. So I don't think in hindsight it was the wrong decision, obviously, but I don't. It's the wrong outcome. The decision-making process and the call to pit, I don't think was inherently flawed.
And of course, there's a problem with timing because the VSC was deployed, and I think the top 7 couldn't get into the pits. But then a group of cars, Piastri down, those who hadn't just pitted, then went in on the VSC, and then you roll around and you try to catch the back end of the VSC in the hope that you'll get the cheap pit stop as well, and sometimes the timing doesn't work. So, yeah, I think you're right. There's an element of hindsight that can make that seem like a mistake when it just seems like the logical thing to do. Mark, there's a question from Gareth Anstey. Did we seriously have a safety car because it was too wet for the intermediates whilst everyone simultaneously refused to use the wet tyres? Surely you can't complain it's too wet to continue whilst not using the wet tyre. Well, a few did go to wets in that moment, but only a minority of drivers.
Yeah, and there's, if you put the wets on, there's a school of thought which says, yeah, this race is about to be red flagged.
It's the safety car tyre, as it's known.
Exactly. So, why not put the wet on and stop yourself from aquaplaning off, but then knowing you can get rid of it for free when it's red flagged. But yeah, there is just the extreme wet is really just to get you through situations where you are about to aquaplane off otherwise. That's all it's for. It's like you say, it's a safety car tyre in effect. So yeah.
And the final question we'll address in this section, tricky one. Andy Sally, Max the Fourth, and Jake Wilkins. Scott's kind of skirted around the edge of this one. The question basically is this one of the best or perhaps the best win for Max Verstappen? Well, certainly one of the best. Anyone wants to say it's the best win? It's always tricky when we're trying to think back all sort of on the fly, all those wins. Obviously, Spa a couple of years ago is one that springs to mind as a really, really well executed win. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, Spa when he went from, 14th on the grid and was leading and pulling away by a quarter of a way through the race. I think was in terms of just sheer virtuosity and flat out superiority, that probably is right up there. But I mean, this called for a slightly different skill set. Really, it wasn't just about expressing his pure speed. There was more to it. So, yeah, I think you definitely have to consider it as potentially his best victory, and he certainly seemed to be suggesting it was in the aftermath.
I don't think I can pick an outright best Verstappen win because, first of all, he's a driver who's won so many different types of races that they actually, a little bit like Lewis Hamilton, they kind of become difficult to grade against one another. But if you had a tier list of Verstappen wins, I think this would be on the top tier, along with obviously Barcelona 2016, Spa 22, like Mark said. I think Miami 2023. I think that was absolutely brilliant. Where he was Sergio Perez started from pole, Max started from ninth, and Max was basically leading by the end of the first stint, wasn't he? Or not long after. He was so quick there. I also agree with Mark. I'd go maybe a little bit further and say this was a different type of win for Verstappen. This was a new way of winning for Verstappen. He hasn't had to win a race. He hasn't been able to win a race like this before partly because the opportunity hasn't presented itself. But we know what his prowess is in the wet. And yes, like, you have to acknowledge the assist from the red flag, because it was a absolutely critical part of the way the race played out and changed his track position. But in much the same way as, and either of you correct me if I'm wrong on this, the German Grand Prix that Hamilton won, when he'd had the problem in qualifying and started down the grid, I believe that's the furthest back that Lewis has won a race from. But that was obviously assisted by race circumstances, wasn't it? And how it played out. But I don't think anyone disputes that that's not one of Hamilton's best wins because of the circumstances around it, the way it kind of changed the narrative in the season and things like that. You can get helping hands on the way to victory, and the victory still be absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, doubly so when you've had the opposite of a helping hand, an unhelpful push, you might call it, in qualifying with the bad luck to be down the grid. So yeah, it's definitely right there for Verstappen. It will. It always takes a lot of consideration when you're trying to rank wins, but yeah, it's certainly up there. Mexico 21's another one that was a very strong victory. He's got a lot of very good wins. You don't win, what's he on, 62 odd wins now, without there being a lot of contenders. Before we finish this section, I guess we should very quickly address the tech controversy of the weekend. I say tech controversy, but it was an almost ethereal one. Mark, what did you make of this suggestion that people may have been using putting a small amount of water in the tyres that Red Bull seemed to suspect certain others were doing, including McLaren? No evidence of it, obviously, and that sort of flared up. And have they suddenly stopped, and that's why Red Bull's good again? Is it that?
Yeah, it's another one in the series of asymmetrical braking on the Red Bull, and we had something on the McLaren as well that was nonsense. Can't remember now, but there's always suspicions, and there's always new ways of possibly getting around regulations that people dream up. This one didn't seem very well constructed. There didn't seem to be any explanation of exactly how it would work in any very convincing way. I suspect it's just paranoia, but let's see if it develops.
Exactly, yeah. You need evidence. There's certainly been some paranoia here, but it's always great, isn't it, Scott? Because as Mark alluded to, it's sort of gone back and forth, hasn't it? And there are people who will say, yes, McLaren and others were definitely doing this, no question whatsoever. And then you say to them, well, that's what they say about you and your whatever you were supposed to be doing. And they say, oh, no, that's completely different. We weren't cheating. This is nonsense. And it's amazing, isn't it? And it always happens when things get close. You get this atmosphere of paranoia. And the paranoia sometimes is reasonable. Teams will push the limits. But this water in the tyres would be a bit like using the bib adjuster illegally, as was suggested it was, but obviously no evidence it was. It would be not a grey area, completely illegal.
Yeah, and while you speak to a couple of people in the paddock, and the theory of adding water inside the tyre through a valve is practically quite simple, doing it undetected is less straightforward, and you'd think it would show up on all manner of ways of measuring data. So much like that bib adjuster, tricky to see how it would be done without being caught, but it's part of the tit for tat, and it's something that has escalated quite a lot over the last 2 or 3 months. I think it's indicative of, I was talking earlier about the pressure that Red Bull's been under and that tension that's creeping in. I think the paranoia is an inevitable consequence of that. And I think Red Bull have been searching for so long for answers to why the season's gone the way it has after such a dominant start, and then being caught by McLaren, briefly Mercedes, latterly Ferrari as well. They know that there's been problems on their side with correlation issues and development missteps and what have you. But Red Bull's position is very much that even if they've had a few issues and McLaren and Ferrari have done a good job, it doesn't quite explain the extent of the swing that they've seen, especially in race pace. So that's where theories like this emerge from. Is it maybe it's not us just taking a step back, it's others getting a leg up, it's others being allowed to exploit things that they shouldn't be allowed to exploit. Flexi wings, for example. This kind of second guessing, whether it's seeing ghosts or not, it does emerge, and it's a little bit of an energy thief and a time thief from the teams that worry about it. And you wonder if Red Bull were slightly better served not going down this route and just focusing on their own issues. But at the same time, it might be an organisation, much like Verstappen as a driver, that responds very well to feeling like its back's up against the wall, to feeling like it is us against the world. That was very much the vibe through the Brazil weekend, as far as I was concerned, from Thursday morning with Verstappen having to bat away question after question about his racing style, making comments about not having the right passport for the paddock, that kind of thing, the Red Bull theory, the anger around qualifying and the way that was handled, timing of the VSC in the sprint race that very conveniently allowed Norris to pass Piastri for the sprint race win, but just came out in time to hold Verstappen back. All of this stuff, if you've either got that mindset, or even if you just, letting yourself have that mindset to G you up, you don't have to look far in F1 to find things to justify your own conspiracy theories or concerns. So how much of it is real worry? How much of it is kind of manufactured concern, even if they're not doing it to piss themselves off, basically, but they just can't help themselves? It's hard to judge. The reality is that they clearly have these worries to a degree because they've started talking about them. What is important is that what is a lot more important is that they've now ended the win drought. They've taken a lot of pressure off their shoulders, and I wonder if we're going to see a slightly more relaxed version of Red Bull over the final few races now.
Yeah, that's very, very possible. And ultimately, Max Verstappen, as I said in the intro, he's as good as won the World Championship. He's 62 points ahead of Lando Norris. Is anyone going to take issue with that claim? It's he's almost certain. Well, he's not. He's likely to clinch it next time out in Las Vegas. And yeah, as we've been saying all season, Norris had the opportunity to make a proper fight of it. He just never got into range. And this, Verstappen with Norris 6 has sort of buried it now. So I guess it's a bit of a surprise it's happened quite so quickly, but yeah, Norris just never got there, did he, Mark? So this is kind of confirming what we expected to happen. It needed a sustained gain of points from Norris, which he never managed to deliver.
Yeah, it was. He was needing coming into this weekend, needing to take nearly 12 points a race off him, wasn't he? And Verstappen actually said I was expecting to lose points to Lando this weekend, and then look what happened. It's never looked like a championship fight, has it? It looked like a mathematical contest without it actually being a fight.
And I think Verstappen would have been wrong to go into that race thinking anything other than damage limitation, because as much as he would back himself, Norris was starting at the other end of the grid to him.
16 places ahead, yeah.
Yeah.
So
So I think that's just that was only realistic. But Verstappen, there's no other way of putting it. Verstappen drove like a world champion in that race, and Norris didn't. Norris, while McLaren was a bit defensive of its drivers and Norris in particular, because he was asked specifically about Lando and the mistakes, by saying that the fact that both drivers locked up so much suggests that McLaren needs to take responsibility for not giving them the machinery. And there is some truth to that. The Red Bull did look like the better car in the wet. But Verstappen was clearly a part of that, and Verstappen made the Red Bull look as good as it was. Verstappen drove a perfect race. There was nothing more he could have done. He didn't put a foot wrong. Norris made errors. And Norris at his peak this season has been a world champion level driver, but he hasn't been at that level consistently, and therefore he hasn't had a world champion level season. Verstappen hasn't been perfect. There have been moments where he's crossed the line, but he has been at that level more often than any other driver this year, and it is almost certainly going to be his championship now, upgraded from very likely to be his world championship, and he's completely deserving of that. This has been a fantastic title success.
Yeah, and a great way with this win to make it near as makes no difference certain that he's going to win the championship.
This episode is brought to you by Merrill. We all have goals, and we all want to get to those goals, whether that's saving for a home renovation, that once-in-a-lifetime trip to your favourite Grand Prix, or even retirement. We all want a straightforward path to those goals, but the real world doesn't usually work that way. Merrill understands that. That's why with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalised plan and a clear path forward. And having the bull at your back helps your whole financial life move with you. So when your plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
Victorinox, the makers of the original Swiss Army knife, have been a reliable companion for life's everyday challenges, mastering functionality, innovation, iconic design, and uncompromising quality with its products. The Victorinox Swiss Army knife provides you with all the things you don't think about until you need it. Tweezers, a screwdriver, and even a corkscrew. With the Victorinox Swiss Army knife, you can be prepared to master everyday life. You can find Victorinox Swiss Army knives at Dick's Sporting Goods.
Right, Scott, we've pilloried Alpine at times this season, haven't we? With all their goings on, but Esteban Ocon taking second, Pierre Gasly taking third. Massively deserved special day and a horrible season for that team. Really pleased for everyone who's worked for that. But where did it come from?
It's emerged from a genuinely positive trend of late, and obviously a particularly extreme manifestation of it this weekend. But they continue to have a car that is capable of qualifying in the top 10. When you've got a car that can get into Q3 or SQ3 as it was in the sprint, depending on the conditions and the circumstances, you put yourself in the frame to do something special, to not just be best of the rest, but maybe be further ahead. And that's what they did for the Grand Prix, because in wet conditions, like Pierre Gasly's been great for at least the last 2 or 3 weekends. Ocon's had a slightly trickier run, but in the wet, Ocon was fantastic from pretty much the first lap in practice, in qualifying, sorry, and has looked just looked like that car has just looked like a front running car in the wet. Certainly a car that was easily going to finish both cars in the points. That's how good it looked. Then when you get the opportunity, like a slightly jumbled grid, other cars being out of position, and then obviously the way the race played out, deciding actually the tyres are in good nick, the drivers are confident, they're comfortable, we're in control of this situation, let's go for it, let's extend and see what happens. Manage that really well, get that track position, and as soon as they had track position, I was pretty confident at least one Alpine was finishing on the podium, because that lineup, while they have their moments and sometimes they go missing and they have similar sort of strengths and weaknesses, I guess, as drivers, I think that lineup is one of the most robust on the grid in terms of when they get an opportunity. Because Gasly and Ocon have fantastic track records at when they find themselves in rare opportunities to grab a podium or a good result, they nail it. I can't think of a single example of them throwing away an opportunity for a massive result. That is where their podiums has come from. Obviously, an opportunistic Grand Prix winner piece has emerged from that. Edd, you mentioned Ocon's defence against Hamilton at Suzuka earlier in this podcast. So, sensible decision-making, 2 very good drivers, great car in the wet, but a general improvement in their performance level in recent races because of an upgrade as well. It's look, it's an exaggerated result, of course, but it's fully deserved. There's, again, luck involved, but this was a deserved double podium.
Yeah, and it's hurled them up to 6th in the Constructors' Championship, which is hugely significant. 35 points this weekend out of their total of 49, so just over 70% of their points pocketed this weekend, which is great. And it was a strong weekend because Gasly was really strong in the sprint elements. In the dry, Ocon was struggling a bit he complained a bit about the rear instability on entry, struggling a bit with the mid-corner understeer. Gasly looked super confident, as he has recently in the dry, and so he had that 7th place in the sprint. Ocon struggled. But yeah, as you say, in the wet, Ocon was fantastic, and Gasly a bit unlucky in qualifying, but he ran sort of the bottom of the top 10 early on and then stayed out and got up. So yeah, this was really, really, really important, I think, for that team, because it has been a mess for too much of the season. And I think it's nice because the progress, as you say, has been there for it to be seen. But to have a halo result like this and not have it's nice to have a great weekend. Oh, we've scored 9th place and scored a couple of points. Great. But to have something like this and get some reward for everyone who's been working hard there, I think is very, very positive for them. And very much shaken up that battle for 6th. Haas obviously had been marching on in the battle for 6th place in the championship. RB were trying to chase them down, and it's been shuffled massively now. And of course, RB, if you'd said to them before the weekend, you'll come out of this weekend with 8 points, they'd have thought, yeah, that's pretty good. But actually, it's a little bit disappointing for them. We had Tsunoda 7th, he ran 3rd in that first stint. Had a pretty good race, Tsunoda, actually. He was one of those ones that pitted as well, so lost a little bit of position on track. Liam Lawson had another action-packed race. Ended up 9th, so that was good for RB on paper, but not quite what they wanted. And one team that wasn't really where we've become accustomed to it in recent weekends was Ferrari. They've had those 2 magnificent wins, and then a pretty difficult weekend. Carlos Sainz had 2 crashes today across qualifying and the race, didn't finish. Charles Leclerc struggled home to 7th place. So what happened to its dominant form of Austin in Mexico?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. And Sainz had suggested it in Mexico, actually. He said he wasn't convinced that Interlagos was going to be a good layout for the car. The corners go on a long time. That slow middle sector. The long corners, they're slow corners, but they're long corners. And that's, the Ferrari seems to lose time if it has to stay in the corner for too long. It's very good at quick changes of direction, short, sharp corners. And it's got, then it can be balanced in a way that allows them to really use the low down acceleration of the engine. And it's quite a potent combination on that sort of track. But I think, as soon as you have to load it up for a long time, that sort of consistency goes away. So I think in their search for a sort of a setup solution to minimise the penalty of that within a sprint weekend, and a sprint weekend in which the conditions were changing from one day to the next or from one session to the next, I think they didn't find the key to even extracting what was possibly in the car there. But I don't think what was in the car around that circuit was ever going to be at the level of Austin and Mexico, which are just 2 circuits that suited very well. I expect it to be absolutely flying again in Las Vegas, maybe struggling a bit in Qatar, and then being fully competitive again in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, and it was, Sainz was very disappointed. Obviously had such a magnificent weekend, but just didn't go well for him. He said it was very strange, the crashes he had today, called it a nightmare day. And obviously Leclerc, he pitted before that virtual safety car, so that was damaging for them. He pitted on lap 24, and Fred Vasseur after the race said, well, obviously we ideally would have stayed out, but we didn't know what was going to happen, and you can gamble, but then you look foolish if you then crash because you're struggling for grip. So Leclerc struggled home in 7th place, and actually Vasseur was relatively content with the way the weekend had played out, because even though it's not helped their Constructors' Championship bid, they're now 36 behind. They only lost 7 points to McLaren, and I asked Fred Vasseur about this. So actually, even though the result's not great, this is actually a pretty good damage limitation, isn't it? I think if you'd said to him on Friday morning, you'll lose 7 points this weekend, he'd have signed there and then, because that would have got them through their difficult weekend. So Ferrari still very much in it. People we haven't mentioned, Oscar Piastri had a slightly difficult one. Things didn't quite go his way. I mean, certainly in the Grand Prix itself, of course, he I'm going to say won in inverted commas the sprint race. Of course, he didn't, because he gave it away to Lando Norris for team orders, because the championship was still vaguely possible at that point. But then, Sunday didn't really go well for him, did it?
No, he was a little bit vague. He obviously all went a little bit awry in qualifying, which he said was partly a mistake, partly a bit of a problem, which he admitted combined created a big problem. And then said they're struggling a bit with that in the race. Now, I don't know if this relates to the locking issue that Stella talked about, because it was locking that I think it was into turn one both times in Q3 that thwarted Piastri, and he had a couple of moments like that in the race as well. So I don't know if logically, I would say it links to that. So ultimately, qualifying where he qualified, with the McLaren having the bigger rear wing and less straight line speed than the others, and no real pace advantage, it was always going to be a tall order to try and make progress. It just wasn't his day. Sort of course was set early on. Little he could do to alter it. But I don't know if you've heard anything else specific about that problem, or if it is our best theory at the moment is it relates to why the car was locking up as much as it was.
Yeah, it appears to be related to that. I don't know if you picked up anything, Mark, but it's in the wet, that's the problem, isn't it? The cars are very sensitive. It's really easy to get into that problem with the brakes. Obviously, we saw Alex Albon had that crash in qualifying, and he was struggling with the brakes all through that session before things eventually went wrong. He thought it was a brake problem that caused the crash. That Williams still haven't said either way. At the time, they didn't think there was anything wrong, but that's still being looked at. And it's very easy just to slip out of the window and have a bit of a handful, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's especially when you don't have very much time to investigate and correlate, and you in a sprint format, you're going from one session to the next in a mad hurry, and then you compress everything further, and you, as I said, the weather's changing from one minute to the next. I think it's very easy to find yourself in a situation where you've got a problem that you haven't quite nailed, and you don't resolve it until you get back to the factory.
Other drivers we should mention. Very, very minor parts played by the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton and Sergio Perez in the second Red Bull. Obviously, Hamilton had a pretty horrible weekend. After the race, he was, he couldn't disguise. He made no attempt to disguise the fact that he was fairly fed up this weekend, and he's almost into, because the car's so all over the place, just can't wait for the season to finish. So I had a very tough day, and Perez hasn't made much of a case to improve his standing. It's worth mentioning Fernando Alonso as well, because I'm sure everyone heard, well, I'm not sure whether it was out there in the broadcast, but he was talking about the back pain and battling on to finish the race. And I must say, Scott, I thought maybe there was a little bit of Fernando Alonso performativeness in that, but I don't think you were there for this, but I saw Fernando Alonso come into the TV pen and doing interviews, and then he spoke to us after the race, and I've got no doubt he was quite troubled, because not only did he have that illness that meant he was quite a late arrival in Brazil, having gone back to Europe, but he was definitely suffering with his back as well. So it was tough for him, but a horrible weekend for Aston Martin. Potentially the worst car, worse than the Sauber.
Yeah, which is really saying something. It was a nightmare weekend. Alonso came into it off the back of he'd missed the media day in Mexico, got through that weekend. I think he went back to Europe to seek some extra treatment. Missed media day again in Brazil, so would have flown in quite late into the event. But the car just wasn't there really from the moment it hit the track. I think they tried 2 or 3 different floor specs. Whatever they brought to, was it Austin? I think they had a floor upgrade that hasn't worked, so they've dropped that and they're trying earlier season iteration versions. Other setup changes as well. So they started the sprint from the pit lane, and then it just never came together. They were always scraping around in. I mean, there were points where Alonso looked genuinely quick in the wet, but they were sort of fleeting, and I don't know if it was ever really an accurate picture, because obviously we know through qualifying in particular that can change so quickly. And then in the race, I had a similar suspicion to you, Ed. It sounded a bit weird, like weirdly specific. Alonso's radio message, we've heard in the past, sometimes he does radio messages to make it very clear how much he's trying and how brave he's being. But there was obviously quite a pained sort of tone to what he was saying. It did sound more sincere, I think, than the words made it sound. And then you're right, Ed, I wasn't there to see it with my own eyes, but I have seen footage of him from the TV pen and heard the way he was speaking. I have no doubt that he was battling on bravely towards the end. So yeah, good effort in the circumstances. The less said about Lance Stroll, the better, I think.
Yes, he had the crash in qualifying, and then the off on the formation lap, and needed his sat nav fired up to avoid driving into the gravel. It was. I'm waiting to see exactly what the team finds out about that incident when he went off, because it was quite odd. There was quite a big spike in the rear brakes, but at the same time, it could just be everything was a bit cold and just got caught out by it. So it looked terrible, and certainly the because they told him he could have reversed, but he tried to sort of loop round to the left to get in and just buried himself in the gravel. So that bit certainly was on him, but we can reserve judgment. It didn't look great, the off, let's put it that way. But that just underlined a horrible weekend for Aston Martin.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
The Acura ZDX is more than just 100% electric. It's 100% Acura energy. With nearly 500 horsepower and an impressive range rating, the ZDX Type S delivers 100% excitement and brings unprecedented performance to the Type S family. And it's 100% loaded with innovative features like an 18-speaker Bang & Olufsen premium sound system, available hands-free cruise, and Google built-in. Test drive the Acura ZDX and unlock electrified performance today.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Right, we've got to our traditional part 3 now, dedicated to questions from the Race Members Club. Vast number after this race. With limited time, we'll only get through a few of them. We'll do our best to tackle more of them in the gap between this race and Las Vegas as well. And remember, if you'd like to sign up or find out more about the Race Members Club, hit the link in the podcast episode description or search for the race on Patreon. And it's not just questions you get to ask, but there's bonus podcasts, all sorts of things. Loads you can get for a relatively modest price. So check that out if you're interested. Mark, the first question to you from Jack Aitken, who, as I like to say, no, not that one. Maybe this is just my Australian bias, but I thought McLaren switching their drivers for victory in the sprint race felt a little extreme for the sake of a single point. On a scale of 1 to Austria 2002, what was the feeling at the circuit? And Callum Duffy asks, when will McLaren let Piastri win again? No one was that bothered at the track, I must admit.
Yeah. I think essentially now the championship fight is extinguished, essentially. We will probably see a more straightforward operation, let's say. That at the same time, while Oscar's peaks have been extremely high, Lando has been more consistently quick, regardless of how McLaren have had to sort of operate between them. But so I don't think you're seeing a particularly false picture. where Lando's running in front, but on the occasion when Oscar is quicker, and they happen quite regularly. I don't think there's any reason now why they wouldn't just let that play out.
And ultimately they had signalled it. They said it could well happen. And because it's sprints, I don't think people are that bothered about it. It's not a Grand Prix win. Okay, yeah, Piastri, I'm sure, would have liked to have won that sprint race, but he's won a sprint race before. He's won a couple of Grand Prix. So, yeah, I don't think it was a big deal. So, yeah, that scale of 1 to Austria 2002, I'd say it's about a 1, to be honest. I don't think there was much concern because the sprint race is not the main event. Scott, a question from Dan Lyons. What happened to Oscar Piastri in the last few laps? With a few laps to go, he was around 3 seconds behind Norris, and that rapidly went to 13 seconds, and then he was passed by Tsunoda on the last lap. This question I put in because it's a really good example of things that can catch you out in races like this, because it actually confused me a bit when I looked at the final results. I thought that exact same thing initially until I remembered what happened some hours before.
Yes, it was a 10-second penalty for Oscar Piastri. Simple as that. There's so much happened in that race. Was that for his clash? It was with an RB, wasn't it?
He did a late move, wasn't quite on.
Yeah, exactly. So it was some harm, some foul, basically with that. So penalty was absolutely fine. I think it happened just after he'd done his pit stop, hadn't it? So that's why he hadn't served it in the stop, and it had to be added at the end, which is also why it made sense for McLaren to do that overt instant swapping of the positions after Norris made the error and dropped back behind Piastri. I think that's why he was behind him on track. So there was no point.
That's the sequence.
Yeah, so there was no point in keeping Norris behind and seeing if he could overtake on merit. It was just going to waste time, hurt tyres maybe. Piastri's race was compromised anyway. Norris is the priority because they were trying to salvage the Drivers' Championship situation. So, yeah, Piastri was just doomed to be in that little pack and then doomed to fall a little bit further back when the 10-second penalty was applied, as has been noticed.
Yeah, the clash happened just before his first pit stop, and the penalty was issued after his one and only pit stop.
Yes.
So that meant, he couldn't serve it. But that was much, much earlier in the race. So very, very easy to lose track of that one. Question from Professor Gratz that I'll take. Why are teams being allowed to use only a single tyre compound in today's race? Is the multiple compound rule suspended in the case of rain? As soon as it's a wet race, you don't have to use 2 compounds, and you couldn't demand they use 2 compounds in a wet race, because that just wouldn't work. Because if you had a really wet race and they somehow weren't under the safety car in the extreme wets, it'd be ridiculous to force people to go onto a tyre that might be not suitable for the condition. So if as soon as it's declared a wet race and those tyres are used, then the tyre rules in that regard go out of the window. Mark, a question from Seamus. Damon Hill said Max's recent driving is impacting his legacy. How has this performance impacted his legacy?
I think his legacy will be that of one of the greatest drivers the sport's ever seen. But with the question marks about his style of racing in extreme situations is the same asterisk that's alongside Michael Schumacher and Ayrton Senna, really. And I don't think anybody says that they don't have a legacy. I don't think there's an asterisk against a legacy when you become so extreme that you clearly, deliberately compromise other drivers. In a championship contest, your championship rival, in a cynical way. But I don't think that really takes anything away from the level that he's operated at. And, for every one of those that we've seen in his career, how many fantastic performances have we seen? And I think that's legacy, really. It's in the round. So I don't think he'd be considered for beatification, but I think he'll be remembered as one of the greatest the sport's ever seen.
Scott, a question for you from Jan Alexander. What's your assessment of a single race result having such a huge impact on the lower half of the Constructors' Championship table?
I said this towards the start of the season, I think I've said it before as well, maybe in previous years. When you remember earlier this year, it was talked about maybe extending the points positions down to the top 12 or maybe even the top 15. I was certainly in favour of the top 12. And one of the reasons was because I felt that with how competitive F1 is now, a team could be 5th or 6th best consistently and be missing out on rewards. I think Nico Hulkenberg is a good example. I think he's finished 11th quite a few times this season for Haas. And my point was always, a team could have those results and only really pick up the odd point or two here and there under the current system, which would leave it vulnerable to exactly this. One big points haul at the end of the year, swinging it to another team. So I'm not trying to take away anything from Alpine, because I think they've done a fantastic job, and I think the way they've recovered from the start of the season has actually been very impressive. This is obviously an exaggerated result, one that they have earned, as I said earlier. Should it, because what did you say it was? It's 71% of their points or something like that?
Yeah, a fraction over that, yeah.
Yeah, I think if you get that in one race, that bigger percentage in one race, and it vaults you 3 places in the points, that to me isn't kind of how a championship's meant to play out. So if you had that point system that was maybe a bit fairer, Haas would be a few more points in the clear, and that would be a fairer reflection, because then Alpine would rightly be in the fight because they have picked up some points and they have improved their trajectory and all of that. And yes, they have a lovely big points haul that's put them close to it, but they wouldn't be in control of that situation. I feel like a result like this should help propel you into a fight that you weren't previously in, but it shouldn't settle one. And we've got a very extreme example here that shows how much of a swing you can have from one result. So I would be quite happy if they reconsidered in the future and looked again at that. Do we extend it to the top 12? I don't like points for every position. I think you need to be fighting. There needs to be some merit still in those real lower points positions. But I'd be happy with top 12.
A question now, well, it's a combination question I'll take. Sam Douglas, Alex Raghunath, Todd Bryant, Paul Balkazak, Ben Hawkes, Scott Keogh and Ryan Laheath all asked variations of this, and it's about the red flag tyre change rules, covering the justification for it, whether it should be changed because of the advantage it can confer, especially given it encourages drivers to stay out on old tyres that might not be fit for purpose. So the key question is, should it change? Well, I think we can all agree it is unfair that it happens. Now, it happens for safety reasons, and there are practicalities to not allowing tyre changes in those sorts of situations. Obviously, you don't want people to run over debris, that kind of thing. The difficult thing is that red flags used to be very, very rare, but now they're much more common. So this happens more often. It used to happen once in a blue moon. The trouble is, you could then say, right, you can't change tyres under the red flag. And then those who hadn't yet pitted would then be able to say, well, hang on a minute, it all closes up and we still have to make a pit stop for fresh tyres. And we've got terrible tyres for the restart. So fundamentally, there is the problem that somebody is going to lose out on it. But I do think that it's worth considering change it just to stop people in that sort of scenario taking a perfectly valid strategy and gambling on maybe that stoppage happening, particularly when we know that once you get towards full wets, you're quite likely to get a safety car or increased chance of someone crashing there being a red flag. So I think the principle of changing it, everyone would sort of broadly agree with, but finding something workable for it that really works is the main challenge. Devil's in the detail on that. We've talked about that a little bit before, but I think the main problem is because there are so many red flags in modern F1, it just becomes such a regular problem. Mark, a question from Sam Bull. He says, on Saturday, meteorologists were mostly in agreement that there was terrible weather approaching for qualifying. Do the FIA and FOM need to be more proactive in these situations, i.e. bringing the session forward an hour? Or does this cause too much of a logistical and scheduling headache? And Simon Ems asks, is the rescheduling of Sunday evidence F1 has learned from Belgium 2021? So 2 questions with slightly different angles, you could say, on the same topic.
Yeah, quite interesting. No, I certainly approve of what they did with bringing the race forward and announcing it the day before, and then you you give people the chance of, of getting there at the new time and not being surprised by it. And yeah, I think rather that than have something that's just not going to get running or is going to run in for very limited number of laps and lots of stoppages. I think that more flexible approach is generally a good one. And the first part of the question was...
It was about whether actually FIA and FOM need to be more proactive in terms of could qualifying have been salvaged on Saturday?
Well, yeah, I guess so. But you've got less to play with there. And there are usually sort of complicating factors in terms of what other events are going on, but probably not so much this weekend. But yeah, I certainly think being open-minded and flexible about trying to get around the worst extremes, and it wouldn't be very often. It's you could more or less say which circuits it might be a problem at pretty much in advance. Spa, it might be Interlagos, it might be the others sort of take turns, but they're regulars, aren't they? So yeah, I do think being more flexible would be a good thing.
Scott, a question from Chris Parrott. Was Kevin Magnussen sick or sick? And that second sick has inverted commas around it.
No, he was sick. He's been in good form since the Haas upgrade, which seems to have given him a little bit more stability under braking. We know that Magnussen is a driver that applies a lot of peak pressure on the brakes, likes to drive the car in, deal with a little bit of understeer, nice and stable. Hasn't quite been able to drive the car the way he has wanted all the time, but it does seem to be a bit more in his favour. 2 decent race weekends coming into this. Got a great track record here. Obviously had that pole position for the sprint race here a couple of years ago. So it was gutting, and he was here on Thursday doing all of the stuff on Thursday, but yeah, unfortunately, condition worsened overnight. They stuck Ollie Behrman in, and given it's a technical track and he doesn't know it, Haas were genuinely surprised by how fast Behrman was on the Friday. Given how quickly he adapted and the fact that Kevin remained under the weather, there was no point in rushing Kevin back to step in just for qualifying. Might as well continue with Ollie in the car. As it turned out, Behrman went on to have a horrible, horrible race with, I think, half a dozen off-track moments or spins or contacts with other cars. Just gutting for Kevin, really, given his F1 career is coming to an end, and he's just, found a nice little sweet spot the last couple of events, found a bit of form. To miss that like this, it's more than just, you can't race on any given weekend. There was a bit of momentum building there, and it's been disrupted.
And a related question, because we're also in the world of Haas. Gavin Cameron says, was Ollie Behrman's penalty overly harsh? Well, it depends how you look at it. I think the penalty was unnecessary, but it wasn't harsh, by which I mean he got caught out. He got on the power out of turn 9, clipped the back of Colapinto, was a bit careless, had a spin, didn't do any harm to Colapinto, carried on. I mean, I'd normally say you just let that go and said, well, you made a mistake, you suffered. However, he did cause a collision. He was, the phraseology is wholly or predominantly to blame. He was wholly to blame for that. So it wasn't harsh. I'd have just probably just shrugged it off and let it go. But pretty horrible race for Ollie Behrman, wasn't it, Scott? I guess he's had 2 fantastic races at the start of his career, and he's due a more challenging one, and conditions don't get much tougher than that.
No, first experience racing a Formula 1 car in the wet. I'm sure he's done a bit of driving in the wet before now, including when he drove that wet weather package, if you remember. That would have been at Fiorano, I guess, when he drove the Ferrari with that wet weather package. But, first driving in anger in the wet. And he's actually, with this appearance, made himself ineligible for the young driver test for Haas at the end of the season in Abu Dhabi. But I spoke to Aya Komatsu after the race, the Haas team principal, and he said that what Ollie's been through this weekend, and especially on Sunday with the wet qualifying and the wet race, he'll have learned a lot more from this experience than by doing that test. So, yeah, not great. Fantastic speed on Friday. Worked the tyres a little bit too hard, used them too hard early on in the sprint race. More lessons there. But yeah, just struggling with brake feel and the locking of the front axle in the race. Had decent pace in the wet, to be honest, but just wasn't controlled enough, wasn't consistent enough, kept making errors. A bit of inexperience there, bit of maybe something going on with the car, but Komatsu wasn't trying to make excuses for him. It was a bad day. He'll learn from it. He's the first person to admit he made mistakes. He's earned himself a bit of a mulligan, hasn't he, with the quality of his appearances so far, but yeah, he'll need to make sure that this is a big deposit into his knowledge bank.
Mark, Simon Ems asks, what actually is wrong with the wet tyre?
It has no grip. It has deep grooves to clear the water, but it makes very little sort of chemical contact or chemical interaction with the track surface. And I mean, a wet tyre generally has much less chemical interaction than a dry tyre, but there is still some on it. It's partly from where the grip is derived. It's the compound is just not really racing compound. It's just a tyre which will clear a set amount of water, really, because of the depth of its grooves.
Yeah, that's something Pirelli's trying to improve for next year. As Mario Isola, their F1 tyre head, he basically said, well, yeah, we're working on an improvement in performance, although we should say that even if you've got a full wet tyre that performs very well, you've still got the visibility problem. That's always going to be there as well. Scott, a question from Martin Hills. Whilst I don't feel that stewards made any particularly questionable calls this weekend, do you feel that the audience and perhaps teams are growing increasingly frustrated with the indecision and procrastination? Case in point, we've just reached the end of a race in which no less than 6 of the top 10 are under investigation. Surely this is untenable and utterly preposterous for the audience in particular. The whole weekend seems to be affected by slow decision-making, or at least poor communication of these decisions and their reasoning, and it seems to have incensed many fans. It wasn't actually that long ago we got an answer for all those investigations, which we haven't mentioned yet because they weren't actually that significant in the end.
No, Mercedes picked up a pair of €5,000 fines, I think, for tyre pressure tweaks on the grid once the wheels were fitted, which is against a technical directive, but was basically brushed aside from a normal sporting penalty because mitigating circumstances of the compressed timetable, awkwardness getting on the grid and stuff like that. And then Lando Norris got a 5k fine for basically causing that aborted start confusion, and then a few others got no further action for basically playing follow the leader. Slightly surprised Lando didn't get a time penalty because I thought it might get treated in the same way that other start infringements do, but they the stewards seem to claim that it was a little bit of a confusing situation, and there was an argument that there's some ambiguity in the sporting regs because they do say when that happens, when you get the aborted start message, you need to return to the grid. But what happens if you get the aborted start message when you're on the grid? Have you already returned to the grid, or do you need to come around again? But I don't think that actually is why Lando did it. I think he just got confused. Anyway, it could have been a penalty. It wasn't. A few of these things needed to be looked at in relative detail, and I can understand with the nature of the race, it being a wet race as well, and it did end up being very chaotic. It was probably the right decision to just bump that to the back of the queue, get the race out of the way first. But I agree that in general, the time being taken to do this stuff is way too long, because we want fast decision making, we want thorough decision making. Maybe the two are irreconcilable, really, but we can definitely have faster decision making and faster communication of it and better communication of it than we have. I think that is a given.
A question from David Tripler, which I'll start off on. This might just be the perfect weekend for a look behind the curtains to see how stressful the job of an F1 journalist can be. Any chance you want to take us through your weekend a bit? Yeah, it's a good question. We're probably going to do a members podcast about this at some point, maybe over the winter. Actually, it wasn't especially stressful, really, was it, Scott? Yeah, we had the change of times, and so it was an earlier start today, and there was a bit of hanging around on Saturday when qualifying should have been happening. But it sort of felt like a fairly normal weekend. Other than that, it's normally fairly busy, isn't it? So I think it's probably slightly less chaotic than you might quite understandably assume it is.
Yeah, today was pretty full on. The rest of the weekend, you do spend bouncing between media sessions and interviews, press conferences. Press conferences and media sessions are slightly different. You have some in the paddock, some in team hospitality. Press conferences is the official FIA press conference room. Speaking to people in the paddock, obviously working at the desk, following the sessions through the weekend, blah, blah, blah. Sunday became a lot more intense because, I mean, just to walk through our Sunday, I think it was a 5 a.m. alarm, leave the hotel at 5:30. We were at the track about 10 past 6, I think. Qualifying, obviously, at 7:30. That was delayed a few times because of red flags. I finished a bit late. And then I spent pretty much my entire time between qualifying and the race in the paddock speaking to people. There wasn't a lot of time. And then race happens, chaotic, loads of red flags and delays. Back into the paddock afterwards, mix zone to hear from as many drivers as possible, and then into more media sessions with team principals because they do their post-race debriefs. And my the thing I disliked the most actually about today was it was one of those where because Verstappen's drive was so good, I'd have really, really liked to get to the press conference to ask him something about it, but I can almost never get to the press conference because of the clashing things.
Well, I'm going to interrupt you here because you've hit upon an important topic there, because we do have a question as well that I was going to end on connected to this from Ryan, who submitted it on Patreon, asking were there really no British media at the podium press conference. From what I've seen, there seems to be a bit of questioning about British journalists not turning up to the press conference because Verstappen won, but you've just mentioned one reason there, because you were doing other things, because that's quite often the case. And I actually think in terms of, if you want to take British media to mean British written journalists, there weren't actually that many at Interlagos. I reckon there's probably only 7 on site of not the TV ones, because all the TV journalists would have been on air and that kind of thing, so wouldn't be there. So actually, a written journalist, I think there were only 7 of us. So I was in the mix zone getting driver comments, so were you. So there's other things to be doing as well. You basically need to be in 3 places at once.
Yeah, I did see Max's comment in the press conference. I thought it was quite funny, to be honest. But bear in mind, I mean, I didn't go to the Thursday press conference either, and I didn't go to the post qualifying one because it is impossible to get to everything. Unfortunately, the way that they're scheduled, you have to pick what you go to, and on Thursday he had a barrage of questions from quite a few, even though it was a small British media press pack that was there. Quite a few of the questions did come from British written and TV journalists, and I think from Verstappen's side that did feel like a bit of an onslaught. So then when he won so brilliantly on Sunday and didn't see any of those faces in the room, and he didn't see our faces either, we weren't there, we're not going to pretend that we were, I can see why it annoyed him a little bit, and I actually thought he was quite sharp with his comment. I thought it was quite funny. But yeah, as I said, that was sincerely, like, I would have liked to have got some insight firsthand from Max about that win, how he kind of rates it in himself. But yeah, as I was explaining in terms of the way the day plays out, it did just get very compressed and hectic today.
Yeah, it's actually quite rare, the post-race press conference we're in. The last one I remember being in was Hungary. I've actually gone up to 10 British written journalists now, because I thought of a few more while you were talking. So I'm just correcting myself now. But there weren't actually that many on site. I didn't realise Max had made that comment. That is actually quite funny. So, but it's worth addressing that, because there's a lot of places to be simultaneously. That's just the nature of the job. But anyway, well, that was an epic look over the weekend. So much going on there. So thanks very much to Mark and to Scott. We've got a couple of weeks gap before the final triple header, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.